Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have Roberto Olivardia. He is a clinical psychologist and clinical instructor of psychology at Harvard Medical School. He maintains a private psychotherapy practice in Lexington, Massachusetts, where he specializes in the treatment of attention-deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, executive functioning issues, and issues that face students with learning differences. Roberto, it's a pleasure to have you back on. Thank you for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. Looking forward to chatting with you guys.
Absolutely.
And then so the last time we met, as you know, for our audience probably remembers, we talked about body dysmorphia. So we wanted to have Roberto
Yes.
back on to talk about ADHD. So for people who don't know, ADHD is not only just a controversial subject, which if you think about it, kind of makes you wonder why, but then on top of that, it's also a very confusing concept. So my patients often ask like, okay, so wait, do I have ADD? Do I have ADHD? Is there a difference between the two? So Roberto, can you first tell us what the diagnosis actually is and give us a little bit about the background of the history of it?
Sure. So it is, it's interesting because ADHD, with all the different conditions and diagnoses that I work with, ADHD is something that most people have heard of and is one of the most misunderstood out there. So first, in terms of what is ADHD, and also just to, talk that, I'm coming from a place as being a clinician, as a professional that specializes in the treatment of ADHD, but I also have ADHD. I am the parent of 2 children with ADHD. So this is, I come from this from many different angles. So first, what is ADHD? So the name is a bit of a misnomer. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. People with ADHD don't necessarily have a deficit in attention. It's more of like dysregulation of attention. So if you imagine that, for lack of a better word, we use the word neurotypical to refer to a non-ADHD brain. Is any brain really typical? I don't know, but we'll just call it that. So you think of a neurotypical brain is like a dimmer switch of a light. So clearly things that are going to be more interesting, anyone is going to be able to better focus and have attention to that. Things that are boring, it's going to be a little bit more effortful. But people without ADHD can better regulate that. If you have ADHD, it's like a good old-fashioned light switch. So if we're stimulated by something, if we find pleasure and interest, we can have higher levels and more cognitive endurance of attention than a non-ADHD person. But if we're not interested, it's lights out. And so to give you a personal example, when I was in high school chemistry class and I was bored to tears because I just wasn't interested in chemistry, and my teacher talked in a very monotone voice and didn't move around at all, and I could not keep my eyes open. This is despite having ample amounts of sleep the night before. So I am literally nodding off, and I'm talking drool down my face. I mean, the whole 9 yards. Thank God iPhones weren't invented back then. Could have had some good viral videos. And I remember looking like, as my eyes and seeing all my classmates and looking at a friend of mine thinking, how does he find this interesting? This is so boring. And so after class, I said, oh my gosh, that class was so boring. And he said, I know, it was so, he talks and talks and he's so monotone. I'm like, oh wait, you weren't bored? And he's like, yeah, I was really bored. I said, but you were like awake and taking notes. And he said, not everyone falls asleep when they're bored, Roberto. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And that was like one of many sort of examples of realizing there's something different of the way I sort of process this. And then there are other things that, I'm a music lover. Obviously, I love psychology. For hours and hours and hours and hours, I could be reading and taking all of that information in with like amazing precision levels of attention. So you have attention dysregulation. You have impulsivity. Now that impulsivity could come in the form of certain behaviors. So people who have impulse control issues of sitting still. It could be, as adults, impulse control issues around substances, around food, around gambling, porn. I mean, you name it. People with ADHD, we carry a significantly higher risk of any kind of addictive behavior. So basically, we like something, we run the risk of liking it too much. So we have to be very careful about that. That impulsivity could be verbal impulsivity. I was a talker. Big surprise. And so, if I wasn't falling asleep, I like to crack a joke just to kind of get the whole class laughing, despite the fact that it was totally disruptive. And my intent was not, oh, I'm going to disrupt this class and be a real pain in the ass to my teacher. It
Right.
was, I am so unstimulated right now that a good laugh, because I know what it does for me. I have very funny friends in my life, and I love a good laugh. So to do that, and it would just, I almost couldn't help myself. Like it would
Mhm.
just like, like blurt out. So you have that impulsivity, you have hyperactivity. Now, keeping in mind, not everyone with ADHD has the hyperactive symptoms. Now, these are the
Mhm.
people that are more likely to get diagnosed younger. We know that boys tend to display those symptoms more, which makes girls with ADHD vastly underrecognized and underdiagnosed. And the hyperactivity is, this sort of motoric sort of energy. Now, in the field, though, however, we've been reconceptualizing hyperactivity as not just physical, but also mental
Mhm.
conceptualizations of it, racing thoughts and things that sometimes get misdiagnosed as anxiety, but it's not
Hmm.
anxiety. It's just this, a lot of sort of just activity kind of going on, because although we can look like we're daydreaming and spacing out, in a classroom window, I
Mhm.
can tell you from my experience, my mind has never been blank. Like I was looking out that window and I was thinking of vast ideas and many, many, many things. And that's where sometimes, honestly, I feel a lot of my creativity sprung from just being so understimulated. And then the other big part is executive functioning issues. So executive functions are all the cognitive processes that our brain has to do to get something done.
Right.
So now this is where we talk about ADHD as not something that just impacts people at school, that this is every life domain. I mean,
Mhm.
organization, prioritization, time management, our working memory, and people with ADHD, our executive functions can be highly impacted by those things. And just as a general statement too, that ADHD can look very different in different people. So you can take 100 people with ADHD, put them in a room. There will be a common sensibility, which is why I always make a plug for the ADHD conference that happens every year. This year it's every November. This year it's in
Mhm.
Anaheim. It's a wonderful community. It's people with ADHD, it's professionals, it's parents, it's educators. And you go to that conference, you really feel like you're, if you have ADHD, you'll feel like you're amongst your peeps. Like, I mean, there's just
Mhm.
this common sensibility. And then there are all of these differences based on personality, based on culture, based on gender. When did you grow up? Like, I was not diagnosed when, I mean, what was known about ADHD when I was a kid was like nothing compared
Mhm.
to now. And
Mhm.
so, that was not something. Now, if you look at my report cards and what teachers would say about me, it's there.
Mhm.
It just wasn't sort of diagnosed. So that's kind of in a nutshell what it is. And this is backed up by a wealth of neurological data that shows that this isn't just an issue of, behavior issues and willfulness, that has very, very strong genetic and neurological underpinnings. And basically, in a nutshell, what we know is the ADHD brain is a very understimulated, bored brain, and
Mhm.
often has a sort of deficit in dopamine, which is a
Mhm.
neurochemical implicated in reward. And so by nature, we kind of have a bored brain. And so I think of ADHD, because ADHD is not a mental illness. It's not an illness. It's just almost like a way of a neurodiverse condition. I think of ADHD as an orientation to the world. Like I am oriented to the world by
Mhm.
what is going to stimulate me. And everything that's pleasurable is stimulating, but not
Mhm.
everything that's stimulating is pleasurable. So we can be attracted to
Huh.
danger. We can be attracted to mischief. We can be attracted, strangely enough, to anxiety, although not intentionally, but anything but feeling bored is sort of where the ADHD brain kind of leans to.
Wow.
Interesting. And so something that I'm curious about, being that we didn't have so much knowledge, when you were a child, about ADHD, when were you actually finally diagnosed with ADHD? And then how did your knowledge of then having ADHD help you to sort of have a sort of, let's say toolbox to sort of deal, I suppose, with school or college at the time, or your interpersonal interactions?
Yeah, so my experience with it was I was not, now this is also hasn't changed that much today, which is even in graduate school, PhD program, clinical psychology, and this is not an indictment on my graduate program, which is phenomenal. This is still today with the percentage, the prevalence right now shows anywhere from an 8 to 10% of the population has ADHD. I learned this much of, I mean, very, very, very little about it. I learned a lot more about schizophrenia, which affects 1% of the population. And I should know a lot about schizophrenia. I should know a lot more about something that affects 10 times the amount of people. The little that I learned even in grad school was conduct disorder, juvenile delinquency, failing grades, high school dropout, drug addiction. And none of those boxes were checked for me. Just didn't relate to it at all. And so my classmates would jokingly say I was hypomanic was the term they would use, and not in a mean way, because I was just I'm an intense person. Like I have a lot of energy, and they would say, yeah, you're kind of the mania, but you don't have the depression part. And I didn't drink any, coffee at the time. And they were like, yeah, that's probably a good thing. And so I always grew up certainly with a sensibility, and my mom definitely, there's no question that's where the ADHD came from. Like I think as a kid, I intuitively knew, and I can tell you that almost everyone that I know with ADHD has this moment where they realize, even before they hear of a diagnosis, that something is different about them. Something is different about how they process stuff. Or I just remember even in kindergarten, literally being like, how are people like sitting still? Like, I just want to like get up and, just start like, moving. And silent reading time for 15 minutes. And I remember pulling a book, Harold and the Purple Crayon, which I don't even remember. I don't even think it has words in that book. And I remember thinking, this is so boring. Like, come on, how long is this going to take? Like, and just seeing that. So I didn't get diagnosed. I think I was 31. I had already gotten my PhD. And so, and what got me diagnosed was, I had my practice, and I was seeing lots of folks with ADHD and reading a lot more about ADHD, and in the way I should have frankly been educated about it, and thinking, oh, wait a minute, this I relate to, when I was reading Russell Barkley, who was like the godfather of ADHD research. I had Hallowell's book, Driven to Distraction. I thought, oh, okay. And this is again before podcasts, but this is like early 2000s. So I was reading this. I said, oh, wait a minute, this I can relate to. And then got diagnosed. And I can tell you honestly, guys, it was not even an epiphany moment. Like it wasn't oh my gosh, it was honest. It was almost like having a pair of gloves. I remember, I'm a very visual thinker. I remember having the visual of finding a pair of gloves, and I'm like, oh yeah, these are the ones that fit. Like, of course, these are the gloves. It was, of course. And then when I looked back in my life, I was a very impulsive kid. Yeah, I did well in school. I was not a straight A student in high school. High school was not easy for me, but I navigated it, but I was a very mischievous kid, like really mischievous. I hung out with, all of my friends had ADHD. I mean, some of them were diagnosed back then, which tells you something. Some of them were not, but I kind of liked being a little bad. Like I liked being a little impulsive, and I was always bored, but out of that boredom came a lot of creativity. And that's where my love of music and writing songs and all of that, so I would make up like board games when I was like 6, because I'm like, oh, I'm so bored playing Monopoly and Clue. Let's make a new board game. And my friends and I would just create like another one. And so I think, to answer your question about kind of with school, I mean, schooling had already basically had happened, but I've always been somebody that leaned into, okay, the way other people are doing this doesn't work for me. I have to figure out something else that works, without knowing the name of ADHD. But I was thankfully always, and I think my parents sort of, without again knowing ADHD, always encouraged the sense of, let's figure out what's going to work for you. And that is what I tell all my patients, is that I did very, like in grad school, I'm not a fast reader. Both of my kids have dyslexia. I probably have a mild dyslexia as well. I had to do a lot of reading, and I can't sit, I fatigue so quickly with reading. However, I accidentally found out in grad school by being on the Boston subway when I was reading one time, I'm like, I can concentrate a lot better on a moving train with people literally inches away from my face with noise and everything than I could in my apartment at the time. So guess
Interesting.
what I did on Sundays? I would take a stack of all my readings and articles that I had to read. And I remember one week I had 900 pages of reading to do, which is insane. I mean, I'm like, I'm never going to get this done. Go pack myself a lunch, introduce myself to the train conductor, and said, I'm going to be riding the subway line all day. So if I have to pay multiple fares, I'll pay it. He said, no, no problem. Just, whatever. And that's what I did for 6-7 hours on that subway train. And I could read, and I did an experiment about this with myself. I could read 6 to 7 pages on the train for every one I could read in my apartment. Can
Wow.
you imagine
Wow.
that? Like,
Mhm.
that was
Hmm.
like, whoa, I felt like I had found gold, but I was always like, and this is what I tell my patients, like, I was always like a detective, like almost like a researcher of myself in that way. And that's why at this point in my life, I can tell you, I know myself really well in terms of what works and what doesn't. But it took, not everything works the first time. I had to go through lots of things that didn't work epically in order to find the things that do.
Of
Yeah.
course. And so one thing, just to, I suppose, tag this this sort of thread. So one thing that really caught my interest is that unwittingly, due to either intuitively impulsivity that you mentioned earlier in class, you would sort of from the outside it would look like you're interrupting the class. However, really you're trying to sort of just get things stimulated for yourself and
Yes.
also classmates. Now, I suppose after, or not necessarily after you were diagnosed at 31, but did you find that once that glove fit and you understood what was going on, that you now had also other sorts of maybe methods, kind of just like reading on a moving train, to
Mhm.
sort of stimulate yourself where otherwise maybe you wouldn't be? Or is this sort of just because you're a detective, you were able to sort of anyway intuitively grasp how to uh, gain interest in a
It seems
particular
more like
subject?
trial and error.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that yeah, it's definitely a combination because once I got diagnosed, what I felt I did feel gifted by the diagnosis. And this is what I want parents that might be listening to this and people is I'm such a proponent for the diagnostic label, not as something that limits people, but quite the opposite. Because
Right.
now I'm like, oh, so you're telling me there's this term I can go into the scientific literature and read about how my brain works precisely? Great. I
Hmm.
mean, now there was so I all of the tools and strategies and all the like detective work I had done before definitely laid a great foundation. But now I was gifted with this term that now I literally bought so many books about ADHD at that time.
Hmm.
And I read them all with a lot of interest. Some I didn't even have to go on the train to read because it was so inherently stimulating to me. And then I mean, I'm dating myself as the internet really started taking off and there were like YouTube videos, lectures about it. And then you now have a million podcasts that are wonderful. The access to information, I just kept relating more and more. And then it was, oh, that's why that strategy worked. Now that I can ground it in the scientific understanding of how my brain works. That's why that worked. Oh, that's why that one didn't work. And then here are some additional things that now could work and come along, with that. I felt like honestly the word gifted with that is sort of the thing that, comes to mind because it's very easy with ADHD for people to have this, especially if you haven't been diagnosed, to have this narrative of something is wrong with me or something is off, with
Right.
me.
Oh,
Or
and I have an anecdote after this about that. Go ahead.
yeah, like, or here I'm trying these things and they're not working. Why? Like, what's going on? Like, how can people like I just and I think humor was a saving grace for me because I
Mm.
have, a very twisted sense of humor, and most of my friends do too.
Yeah.
But Freud said humor is the healthiest defense mechanism. I'm a big lover of the art of stand-up comedy. I used to
Hmm.
study
Hmm.
those people when I was younger, what made people laugh. But I would almost find humor in it, but honestly, the humor was mixed in with this frustration. Like, how did people get a paper done, for example, like a week before it was due? How is that even possible? You know, in 5th grade, we had a month to read a book and then do this artistic expression of the book. And I skimmed the book and did this horrific diorama, which is such an 80s term, but like shoebox, like it was awful. It was this book called The Mad Scientist Club, which I honestly just skimmed 3 pages and I just made it up. And I remember this girl in my class who read Little House on the Prairie, and she made a Conestoga wagon made of pretzel, like long pretzel sticks. Like she glued them. It was beautiful with this cloth. And this is how naive. I mean, I said, wow, like, how did you do this in like a day? Like that looks like it takes hours to do. And she looked at me like I was an idiot. Like, what are you talking about? She goes, I've been doing this for a month. The day we got it assigned to us, I started reading it and I thought, really? Like, and part of me thought that she was kind of crazy, but it was probably my own projection of like, oh, like I'm the one that's kind of. So thankfully, I was protected a little bit. I think, you know, I credit my parents, and again, that ADD-ness was sort of in our family in a way that I could see it in other people. It's not like I was alone with it, you know, and with friends of mine. But there was absolutely that sense of, why is this so difficult? Like these sort of seemingly easy things. And that's what pains me with a lot of the folks that I work with ADHD, particularly adults who get diagnosed later on. They have so much of the work at the beginning is undoing this narrative of I'm a failure, I'm lazy, I'm stupid, I'm crazy, all of those things.
No,
You
we'll check.
mentioned an anecdote that you had.
Well, so check this out, right? So I grew up in the 90s. And so in the 90s, ADD, as I'm sure obviously you know, so in the 90s, ADD wasn't a thing. So I'm going to give you guys a contrast, like two kind of contrasting, I guess, versions of me in school. So here's younger me or little me in school. So this was in about 3rd grade. So in 3rd grade, as you know, most kids are, first of all, most kids are mostly bored, right? I, with ADHD was severely bored, right? So what I would do is I would bring in like these little wrestling toys with me, and I would bring them in and I would play with them under my desk, right? I tried my hardest to be conspicuous about them, but obviously it was pretty hard, right? So then the teacher at the time, so my teacher was super pissed off. Like, so he would like pretty much berate me. He wouldn't obviously curse me out or anything like that, but he would make like these little digs and these little jokes at me, right? So I was like, oh, okay, fine, you know, whatever. He got offended, you know, fuck it. Let me just kind of move on. Maybe I shouldn't do this, etc. Right? Then I figured, okay, I can't really do this. I can't really sit through the class. So essentially what I started doing, and by the way, this was so automatic. So I know this is me going back to my 3rd grader brain. So maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but the way I remember it, that I wasn't fully in control of it. It just kind of happened. I would literally sit in my chair and I would stare up at the sky because I was so bored, and I would kind of start talking to myself, right? And so what I would do is, in my mind, I would create like these like scenarios of like wrestlers. And so, you know, I'd be like kind of fighting it out and talking it through and doing like these little promos and stuff. And then so once he caught wind of that, right, he would literally again call me out, and he would say like, dude, like he would say this in front of the class, and he'd be like, yo, you're such a strange kid, man. Like, what the hell is wrong with you? And he literally said this in the middle of the class. And then so it became kind of like a running joke amongst my classmates where they were like, yeah, like, why do you do that? Why do you talk to yourself? And it's like, oh, that's the kid who talks to himself. And so like in my mind at the time, obviously with ADHD not being a thing, I had no idea what the hell the issue was. I was like, I don't know. I just kind of do this stuff automatically. I'm like, you don't understand. I literally try to sit in my chair and I try to listen and I try to participate and talk to everybody else, and I just cannot do it. And so automatically, as I start kind of zoning out, I'm like not even paying attention to it, but I'm creating these scenarios that unfortunately I end up verbalizing. So that's one version. Then you fast forward to grad school where we know what ADD is, right? So this became, so this wasn't like triggering me for any like reason or in any way, but this was like a funny thing. So at the time I was taking research methods and statistics. And so for anybody who knows me knows I'm terrible at statistics. Our friend Dana tried to actually like sit me down to get to teach it to me because she's really good at it. And I just couldn't do it. I couldn't focus. So so when we were going through the class, so I literally would fall asleep again inadvertently. So I'd fall asleep. And one time the professor at the time, Nick Sabrava, shout out to him if he ever listens to this. So he came up to me, right? And he's talking like louder and louder. And all of a sudden I wake up and then he's like, oh, are you paying attention now? And I said, oh man, I'm really sorry. And he's like, I'll tell you what, guys, if we could get Leon to stay awake for one full class, I promise I will give everybody an A. And I'm like, yes, let's fucking do it. Let's go. So, but what I love about that is the contrast, right? So on the one hand, here's a person who took it supremely personally and decided to
Yes.
embarrass me in front of everybody else. And then on the other hand, obviously who's also a clinician. So to kind of contrast it in a fair way here. So obviously he understood the diagnosis. He understood that this had nothing to do with him. It was the material. Obviously it was going to be boring for most people. It was
Yes.
certainly going to be boring for me. So yeah, so what I would, in relating that anecdote, I would want to ask in terms of the way we now conceptualize ADD, right? So obviously for a grad student, I mean, you're not going to really call somebody out who's like, your own age or your own size, obviously. But are we seeing in the world, and in terms of just the way kids are dealing with it, are we seeing a better understanding with it in education, in classrooms, with parents, etc., where like stuff like that happened to me in the 90s isn't happening so much anymore?
Oh, 100%. And I can relate to that story very much because so one of the things when you talk about the wrestling toys, so this is one of those things that we understand about ADHD is, fidgeting, whether it's fidgeting, shaking your leg or with an object that I remember as a kid, ninth grade, long government class, I loved the drums. And so I would like kind of drum with my fingers, on my legs and my teacher would say, would you stop doing that? And like really meanly, not in a like, like, and I'm thinking, this is under the desk. Like, I'm not even bothering anybody. What are you talking? Like, and that was sort of my attitude, frankly. Like, I was like, why do you have a problem with this? And I said, this just helps me pay attention better. And she goes, that's not helping you pay attention better. She goes, like, you're lying to yourself if you say that. And so I'm like, no. And that with certain people, I would almost get like kind of combative, around those kinds of things. And sure enough, now that we know with the research, there's a great book, a plug for this book called Fidget to Focus. It's a very small book by a researcher who talks about how fidgeting, guess what it does? It basically stimulates frontal lobe centers of the brain that help us pay attention. And so what you were doing was intuitively having a strategy with those wrestling figures to keep yourself grounded. And you were being sort of called out and said, oh no, you're doing something strange and weird. And meanwhile, you knew yourself better than what this person sort of knew of you. And so I part of me relates to, and then part of me feels for you that you were shamed in that way around it. But to answer your question, 100%, I mean, that it's so much better. We still have a ways to go, but the thing I definitely noticed, and this is, I'll credit social media because social media has a lot of problems with it. But one of the things I absolutely credit is a lot of young people I work with now, I don't see the stigma that I did even 20 years ago around it, because most of the young people I work with have a friend with ADHD. They see, there's an influencer that they're listening to. And there are a lot of people on social media who might say they have ADHD and their information isn't always accurate, but there are some really good, there's a if you're familiar with the Holderness family, for example, it's this husband and wife, and they have children. They've been doing videos actually for like a decade. And it's not even, their videos initially were just fun songs and things like that. Well, it turns out the husband, and they were also on The Amazing Race. They won one of the seasons of The Amazing Race. The husband, I believe, I'm blanking on his name, I think Ryan Holderness, has ADHD, and they just wrote a book called ADHD is Awesome, is the name of the book. And if you watch those videos, they're hilarious and they're so relatable. And it presents ADHD as like, it's not minimizing the difficulties, because there are things about it that suck for people. I mean, that, get in the way, that are frustrating. And this is what I want to also say is, and there are things about this brain that are amazing. And I would never want to change my brain for anything in the world, because it's like, I always tell my patients that you have to think of your brain like a coin. The heads and tails, you can't separate them. So I can attribute the not so great moments and dark moments to that ADHD, and the best things that I love about things to that ADHD. Like, I am in I don't even call this my job, because I think that word to me has a sort of connotation of like your job, this is what I do. And I love what I do. Like, I really, really, like, I remember a neighbor of mine when the Powerball was, I don't know, 2 billion or whatever it was dollars. And he said, oh, what would you do? And I'd say, I probably travel more. I'd buy a drum set. I'd, get but I'm like, I would still go to my office. Like I really wouldn't, like, I will never retire unless I can't talk or think. Like that's
Right.
about it. But I could do this till I'm 90 something, you know, and I plan on living to at least 100. So, um, but I tell people I have to love what I do. But see, that's part of that ADHD brain. I would be kind of dysfunctional at a job that I didn't love, you know, at work. I don't know how people do that. And I remember as a teenager being kind of terrified about being an adult, thinking, well, all I know is I like music. That's the only thing. So, you know, told my parents when I was a junior in high school, you know, and I'm the youngest of three immigrant parents, and where education was super important. And my dad was an educator, and saying, yeah, I don't think this college thing is going to work for me. Like I'm just going to get into a lot of trouble and on your dime. And they sacrificed a lot, like my parents. And I said, and my dad calmly, you know, asked me like what I was going to do instead. And I said, I think my friend is starting a punk band in LA. I'm just going to play drums in his punk band. And I can laugh about it now, but I was serious. I'm like, I know I will love it. Do I think I'm going to make a great living out of it? No. Like, I'm not a Grammy award. I can keep a beat, but I'm not like a drummer. You know what I mean? And then senior year of high school, I took psychology, and that changed everything. Like, that was like, oh my gosh, I love this. And that's the thing. We have to find, once we can hook into that thing that we love. But I see a lot less stigma. I see a lot more understanding, you know, certainly in the educational field. A lot of, interestingly, parents nowadays adults are often diagnosed when their kids are. And so, you know, I can't tell you how many meetings, and I'm saying this humorously with the people, is when I'm sitting down with the parent after maybe doing a clinical evaluation with their kid, and I'm describing ADHD. So many times I'll have one of the spouses that look at the other one and are like clearly you're describing, you know, my spouse here. And then the parent that has ADHD, sometimes it could be both, is sort of like kind of laughing and saying, this sounds a lot familiar. And then sure enough, because it's highly genetic. So if you have ADHD, there's a much higher chance than not that you'll have a kid with ADHD. If you have two kids, there's like, I think like a 33% chance both will have ADHD. So, you know, I'm like, here we go, get ready, you know. And even when my son, I could have diagnosed him prenatally, like honestly, the womb. Every ultrasound we had, I'm not kidding, every ultrasound they'd be like, whoa, this kid is active. Like he is an active, like punch, 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 punch. Like he just wanted to like, and he's his father's son. I mean, but the benefit is he's being raised in a very different time, and with a parent that totally understands this, not even just from the professional level, but from a personal level. The resources that are available in school now are totally, I mean, it's just a totally different thing. Again, we still have a ways to go, but oh my gosh, so much better.
Yeah, and something I'm also curious about, is there sort of a spectrum to what degree someone has ADHD? And then if, let's say there is that spectrum, if somebody's somewhere in the middle or lower, do a lot of people then go undiagnosed, not even thinking to get checked? And then last part of the question, do you think those people who have even an inkling that they might have it should maybe go see and, you know, get diagnosed?
Yeah, so ADHD is, we would think of it in a bit on a spectrum, because it could manifest so differently for different people. And so you might have, and we are born with it, but it's so important to understand that the manifestation of it is so based on our environment. So for example, I might do a consultation with a college student who never said, I never had an issue with school before, or paying attention. I don't know what's going on. And you don't just develop ADHD at 20, for example. But the questions I ask, and this is where a clinical evaluation and getting the story behind these symptoms is so important, that it's not just a questionnaire. It's not, neuropsych testing actually often can have a high degree of false negatives of people who don't test as having ADHD, but actually do. Because if you think about it, neuropsych testing, you're one-on-one in a distraction-free environment,
Yep.
doing tasks that might be 2 minutes. That's not generalizable to
and
sitting.
and there's some subjectivity where they ask you questions like, how often does this happen? How often does that? You have no idea how many times I have patients who underplay it. And so they'll get a score
Exactly.
of like 4 or 5. And I'm like, no, your ADD is not at 4 or 5. Go ahead.
Exactly. And Russell Barkley, who again is leading researcher, says neuropsych testing should never be used for the diagnosis of ADHD. Learning disabilities, however, neuropsych testing is great for assessing for learning disabilities, of which 50 to 60% of people with ADHD have a learning disability, such as dyslexia, which affects reading, writing, spelling, dyscalculia, which affects mathematics, dysgraphia, which affects fine motor movements, nonverbal learning disability. So when you have this sort of manifestation, you want to get the story behind it. So with this particular student, I said, what was school like for you? Now, sometimes your intelligence could be a compensating factor. This was I'm in the Boston area. I'm near Harvard University. I see a lot of Harvard students. This was an undergraduate at Harvard. Clearly, he's a very bright individual. And I saw this in myself in the sense that, I went to a public school and outside of Boston. It honestly wasn't a particularly challenging school. Like, I think if I had even gone to that same school now, it would be a different story. If I went to high school now, I can guarantee it would have been a different story, because what my kids are doing in high school, totally different level in some ways of what I was doing. So this was a super bright person. He also went to a private school of which there were less than 100 people in his graduating class. So his classrooms were maybe 14, at most 14. I went, in a high school where there were 30 kids, like, in a class. I graduated with 500 kids, in my high school class. He also had parents who were very involved and really supported and scaffolded him. He grew up in a family with means. So he had a tutor that met with him 3 times a week. And these are all great things, by the way. But it's important to understand that support in some ways could have like masked some of those symptoms, that if he didn't have those, and I credit his parents for having, because they, again, didn't know he had ADHD, but had an intuitive sense that he would need these resources. And so now he goes to college, he doesn't have the tutor, he doesn't have his parents there. You have to manage your own time, all the executive function. And he felt like everything just kind of fell apart, for him. So it is on the spectrum, and how it can manifest in different parts of life. I mean, the pandemic, for example, was awful. I mean, obviously for everyone on so many levels, but I can tell you diagnostically for my ADHD patients was horrendous. I mean, to work from home, I came into the office. I did not miss one day in the office, even though I was seeing everyone virtually, like during that time. I still dressed the same as I dress. I still wore shoes, even though my friends are like, wear sneakers. Nobody can see below your waist. I'm like, I needed to hold that frame for myself. I'm like, I don't want to work at home. Like, I needed that boundary. There were so many distractions, and so the environment matters. And so, yes, I would recommend for anyone who, when you hear a podcast or people who are hearing this conversation, there are going to be aspects of it that everyone can relate to. Like, oh, I remember that class, I fell asleep and I was bored. But I can honestly tell you that people with ADHD will relate to a lot of what we're talking about, like in very specific ways. That's why I'm so glad you shared that anecdote about the wrestling figures and staring. I also talked out loud to myself. I'm a verbal processor, so I talk to myself all the time, and people thought it was weird. And I'm like, well, this is just what I do. I don't know what to tell you. But when we share those kind of anecdotes, that's where people like, oh, wait a minute. And again, there's no harm in just getting an evaluation and testing it out. And sometimes it's not ADHD. Sometimes it's anxiety related. Sometimes it's a sleep issue. If someone has a substance abuse problem, it's a substance abuse problem. I mean, that's always, never a good thing in terms of attention and executive functions. Sometimes it's trauma. I mean, there could be lots of other things that can mimic ADHD. So that's why it is also important to not because, you know, again, sometimes I've done consultations where people are like, oh, I definitely have ADHD because I saw this social media person, and I'm like, okay. And then when I do the consultation, sometimes it's not ADHD, it's trauma, it's, you know, all of these other things that could sort of be, it, you know, could be a bipolar disorder.
Right. Right.
Now, having said that, with ADHD, it is the rule rather than the exception that most people with ADHD have a comorbid disorder, which then can complicate the diagnostic picture more. 20% will have a depressive episode. 30% will be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. Again, significantly higher risk of addiction. I treat men, as we talked about before, with eating disorders. I see a high comorbidity of ADHD and binge eating disorder, ADHD and bulimia. You see it in substance abuse populations. So that's also important. Then when we know, you know, 20% of people with ADHD have a bipolar spectrum disorder. And so it can be hard sometimes to tease apart. And this is what I'm specifically in the ADHD community is the thing I specialize in are those comorbidities and how do we screen that out? And sometimes people are diagnosed with bipolar and they don't have bipolar disorder. They have severe ADHD. Sometimes they're diagnosed with ADHD. They have bipolar disorder, and sometimes they have both. And one is often, you know, I see a lot of folks with ADHD and OCD, for example, which people think are opposite disorders that you can't possibly have them both. Yes, you can have them both. So if anyone even suspects it, I say go and, you know, get some further clarification, because if you do have, either way, if you do have ADHD, I want people to feel gifted by that diagnosis to then avail themselves to the information and the resources and the support and the community. We're a great community. Like this year's conference is in Anaheim, like right across the street from Disneyland, for God's sakes. I mean, like, come on, like, you know, but if it's not ADHD, that's also really important because it means something else is not working or needs treatment and deserves those kind of resources. So either way, if something isn't working in your life, seek some clarification on that.
Yeah. And then, so can you speak to the controversy of all of this? So the question would be here, if it is a spectrum, and if we see that there are distinctions between what we would call, let's say, neurotypical as opposed to somebody with ADD, you know, in that context of being neuroatypical, why is it that people think A, it's either overdiagnosed, or B, it just doesn't exist altogether?
I know, it's so frustrating. So this is what, first of all, the research says, because I always, you know, want to clarify the science, you know, of this, that the science actually shows that it is more underdiagnosed than it is overdiagnosed. Now, does that mean there are, you know, are there people that are diagnosed with ADHD that do not have ADHD? Absolutely. As I just mentioned, I've seen that. I see far more people who have ADHD who have not been diagnosed with ADHD, or where their ADHD symptoms have incorrectly been subsumed under another diagnosis. Like all of this is their substance abuse issue, as opposed to actually it's their ADHD that is lending itself to, it's creating that substance abuse issue, that need for dopamine. And because I always say with ADHD and comorbidity, if you are ignoring the ADHD and it's not being treated, it will, not can, it will undermine the treatment of any comorbid disorder, 100%. And I've seen this so many times with, I had a client I've been working with for years, and when I started working with him, he had already been through drug rehabilitation 3 or 4 times for heroin, for coke, for alcohol. Finally, when he got sober from that, developed a binge eating disorder, and then went to eating disorder programs, recovered from that, and then developed a sexual porn addiction. And so that's when he came into my office, because he had seen a webinar I had done about addiction and ADHD. And it turns out, I mean, he absolutely fulfilled like every criteria of ADHD. And when he learned that about sort of dopamine and how addiction is related to that, he felt like he actually was like tearful about it and thinking, oh my gosh, so it's not that I have quote unquote all of these problems. He goes, you don't know how many times I've been told, even by clinicians, that I was self-destructive, that I was a saboteur in my own life, as if I wanted this in some ways. And
Wow.
for you to tell me that this underpinning is this thing called ADHD that can lend itself to all of these manifestations. And if you're saying we can treat this, that it can treat, it was mind blowing, to him in that way. So, I think part of it is because, again, it's not the same thing in everybody. With depression, again, there's always variability in even things like depression. Like we know that men, for example, who are depressed might act out in more angry, externalizing behaviors. And we can misdiagnose that and realize, oh, this could be a depressed individual. Just because they're screaming and yelling doesn't mean, and the fact that they're not crying, that they're not depressed. But with ADHD, it can really sort of vary in that way. And so because of that, people tend to think, oh, everybody is ADHD. No, like we don't like, just like, oh, I'm so OCD. When people use these kinds of terms, it's so troubling. It's like, no, everybody gets bored at some time. Sure. Everyone gets distracted at some time. Sure. Everyone has lost their keys. Absolutely. What we're talking about with ADHD is a collection of these kinds of experiences that are consistent through somebody's life that get in the way consistently. And you had mentioned earlier about like relationships. I mean, that's a whole other area. If you don't understand ADHD and you go into a relationship and your partner doesn't understand ADHD, there are going to be problems. People with ADHD have a higher divorce rate and I can tell you, I remember early on, my relationship that, when we would have like, my wife and I would have conversations and I'm like, finding something to do while we're talking. I'm washing the dishes because in my mind, I love the saying like kill two birds with one stone. Like I love being like hyper efficient. And she'd be like, you're
not
like,
paying
you're not
attention to
paying
me.
attention to me. And I'm like, no, I'm actually paying attention better, than I would. Now, interestingly, what I do, I have to sit and listen and talk, and I can totally, and I've honestly never been bored at what I do. So it's not like I need to be fidgeting, sitting with patients, but with other people in my life. And at first I was like, no, I am like paying attention. So she had to understand, no, I really am paying attention. And I had to understand that doesn't mean, okay, I can always do the dishes. Like she may need for me to sit and like be looking at her and understanding that, but there's a negotiation. Like sometimes she's okay with that, kind of thing. And so understanding the ADHD affects your relation, that's a necessity to sort of understand, relationships as well and to function, in those relationships. But yeah, that issue of the over, diagnosis, it's still, we still are at a place, I think, of seeing how here are these kind of collection of symptoms and traits. And just because they're different in different people doesn't mean this thing isn't a real thing in that way.
Yeah, and what I love about that is with my couples who I see with ADD, where at least one, or maybe even sometimes two people have it. What sometimes seems to help, not always, but sometimes, was when you tell the person, okay, like, do you think it would be helpful if your partner, if you sat down and your partner said, well, both of you, right, and your partner said something like, hey, this is really important, and I really need you to listen right now, right? So we try to kind of calibrate it. Where on the one hand, you'll say something like, okay, like if you want to kind of like do this other thing and listen to me, that's cool. We could do this for now. But if it's something that's really important, then I'll actually tell you and we'll actually, get you to sit down and pay attention. So that seems to help, because if a person tends to personalize, I mean, on the one hand, what happens is the person's obviously really upset and they're like, hey, I'm telling you this really important thing. You're not listening to me. And then the other person is like, yeah, but I am listening to you. So it's sort of like to say that, okay, on the one hand, even though it's true that you might be listening, on the other hand, your partner also needs to feel it. So I would say 9 times out of 10, the ADHD person will be like, oh, totally. If you could just tell me, hey, this is a really important thing, I promise you, I will stop everything that I'm doing. So it's kind of interesting how you kind of have to navigate these things with ADD. Exactly. But yes, there is a tendency to take it personally from the other end.
Well, and I think that exactly, like, to hear that feedback is important, because people with ADHD sometimes get mislabeled as being not empathic, when actually studies show that if anything, we have a higher degree of emotional sensitivity and empathy. And sometimes that can lead to emotional dysregulation and mood disorders and things like that. Like I've always been a very, very sensitive kid. And I've been kind of like a very tough, like assertive kid at the same time. Like that duality has always been there. But I remember in graduate school, in my early training, the first clinical work, audio sessions would be audio taped, and your supervisor, and I have 3 supervisors, would hear the cassette tapes and they give you feedback. It was great. You kind of, and all of them said the same thing. And again, keeping in mind, this is before diagnosis of ADHD. And they said, you come across as very empathic. You clearly are diagnostically understanding them well. And all of them independently. It's not like they all convened and, they said, you talk though really fast and you don't allow for silences in the room. So I would ask the client a question, and if they took more than 2 seconds to answer, I'd jump in. And thankfully they knew that I was almost like trying to rescue them, because it was a projection of my own. Like, I'm a fast processor. I used to do improv. Like, I mean, I love that. It's like, so if you ask me a question and I'm sitting there for a long time, I'm probably don't know it, or I'm like kind of overwhelmed by it or something. So I would project that, and it didn't occur to me that people just need some more time to sort of process. And frankly, it's not, I don't always have the right answer that comes up. I'm just more impulsive too. I mean, like sometimes, yes, I'm a fast processor, and other times I don't process enough and it just like blurts out. But when I would hear it, guys, like on the audio tape, I'm like, oh my gosh, that sounds so rude. Like, I did not want to come across it. Like, and I can hear it. And I am like, and then the other thing they said is, have a lot of high energy. That's great. That's what people love about you. I mean, I loved a lot of the professors, and they said, however, you want to be aware when you're sitting with certain people, particularly people who are very low energy, that can be very overwhelming. And I have heard that throughout my life, but not always in that kind of way, where people like, you are just intense. Like, I mean, there is like, I remember a teacher saying, that if you plug my finger in an electric socket, I could probably like power like the building. But they didn't say it in a nice way. Like, it was more like, you are just like, oh my gosh, come. But that was so helpful. And then when I would hear it on the tape, I'm like, oh, whoa, okay. And what I appreciated about how each of them, and granted they're clinicians, but still, like, they framed it as, we know that you care and you're being empathic. Like, we know you're not being rude, and because it could be very easily personalized, that, to think, oh my gosh, like so, you kind of get that feedback. But absolutely, with couples and relationships, it's having that kind of dialogue is so important, because you don't want people to jump to a conclusion of, oh, that person doesn't even care about what I'm saying because they're not, looking at me, or, things like that. And so that's the other thing, is that ADHD sometimes doesn't present as, oh, I'm going to see a clinician for ADHD. It will present as all of these other things. So if you're working with couples, and when you work with enough couples where ADHD is in the mix, you'll see a lot of the same issues that sort of start, to come about. And that may be where they first hear of ADHD, is when a couples therapist, or in rehab, for example, where it's like, that's the first time. I have a client now, the first time he heard of ADHD was when he was in rehab for alcohol addiction, and heard about it. And he's like, oh my gosh, he goes, not only do I have ADHD, he said, but it's no question that his father, who was also an alcoholic, had ADHD, but, had to quit school, because when his father's generation, they just said, you're uneducable. Like, you can't be educated because you're so dumb, basically.
Wow.
And so imagine carrying that, and, having someone to have a good sense of self, from that. And I hear stories. I remember years ago, I did a talk. I was at a senior citizen center, and it was actually about hoarding, which I do some work in that area. And I had just mentioned briefly about the different comorbidities, and one of them being, we know ADHD and executive functioning issues are actually very common in people who hoard. And I was talking about a little bit about ADHD, and at the end of the talk, I can still remember exactly how this man looked. And he came up to me, and his eyes, he had blue eyes, and they were just filled with tears. But it was almost like I could tell they were like almost happy tears. And he was 92 years old, this man. And he said, I just want to thank you, for this talk. He goes, but what you said about ADHD, he said, you literally just in 5 minutes described me in a way that I felt more understood than I ever have in my life. I was like, and I'm now tearing up, as I'm hearing this guy. He said, I grew up and they literally called me a dunce. The teacher wrote a note to my mom and basically said, don't bring him back, don't bother, put him in, a trade. And now the shred of that is that maybe the teacher was onto something, that it was hard to learn in a traditional classroom environment, maybe working with your hands, which is valid, but as opposed to, hey, let's also educate, this kid and not just render him, stupid. And he actually had a very successful life. He created a business and such, which the entrepreneurial world is filled with people with ADHD and learning differences. But he said, I always felt like a fraud. He says, even though I've been on paper very successful, and he goes, and now I'm looking, and he says he has grandchildren and great grandchildren who have been diagnosed with ADHD. And he said he never saw it in himself until I described it in that way. Wow. And at first he goes, my first reaction was, oh, I passed this down to them, like this contaminated sort of gene. And then he realized, but the way you described it, I'm like, well, nowadays it's so different. And maybe I passed down some of that entrepreneurial spirit, that I had. I'm like, absolutely. And oh my gosh, I gave the guy the hug. I mean, it's those kinds of things that it pains me to think about the generations of people who just didn't have access to that information. We didn't have treatment, accessibility in that way. And it pains me even today that I'll still get emails from people who are not getting what they need in schools and, in life in general.
And what's so funny is, as Alan and I were talking before this, so I'm having problems with the health insurance company for one of the insurers that I take, and it was so funny because Alan's giving me his take on it, like things that could be helpful, right? And so he's talking like a lot of great ideas, right? But the last one he says it, and then he's like, you know what? Actually, no, I take it back. That only sounded good. And I was like, yeah, it did, right? So it sounded like a really great idea, but then he's like, yeah, well, I kind of started thinking about it, and it wasn't. So that's the ADHD brain, I think, at work, right? So somebody who's kind of like who's working and who's processing and who's coming up with really ingenious and kind of, some ingenious ways of solving a problem, but yeah, they're not necessarily true.
Yeah, which is interesting. That question I asked earlier about a spectrum, and then should someone who might have it, get diagnosed if they don't really recognize it in themselves. As I was listening to you, I was starting to think, maybe, but I couldn't exactly tell. I do gravitate towards things that are stimulating. I did figure that out about myself intuitively. I guess I just need to make that distinction. Oh, is this like, that neurotypical version of that, or is this something to check out? But I guess Leon seems to agree that I might have.
I think you definitely are. Over the years, yeah, over the years, man.
All right.
We've had several examples that came up that I even said it to him for over the years, and so we got to start wrapping up. But I said this to him over the years that I definitely think he has ADD. Okay. Great. So as official diagnosis, yeah, get some treatment, bro.
We do have good ADD radar. I have to say, people with ADHD, we have good radar for other folks with the birds of a feather flock together.
A game recognized game, man. We know. Okay, so Alan, final questions for Roberto as we wrap up.
Yes. So if we wanted to follow your work, say a publication that's either published by you or maybe one that you co-author or are featured in, where can we do that?
Yeah, so I don't have any social media presence, and I don't have a personal website. However, I would recommend, so I'm on the scientific advisory board for Attitude. So it's ADDITUDE. And if you Google them first, I would say that's a phenomenal resource. I really fell in love with that resource as a professional, as a parent of kids with ADHD, as someone with ADHD. Started writing articles for them, webinars, podcasts. They asked me to be on the board. So it really evolved into that. And I'm very proud to be affiliated with them. and they know their audience. So if you go on that website, you're going to not get these long, drawn out articles. It's going to be short, to the point, with to-do things that you can walk away with. And if you go on that website and you write my name in the search, you'll come across a page of multiple articles, podcasts, webinars, which are all free, that people can hear. I have done webinars on ADHD and cannabis dependence, ADHD and OCD, bipolar disorder, sleep issues, eating disorders. So I would say that's probably the best site to get the most. And then honestly, if you just Google, put my name in YouTube, you'll come across, lots of stuff of either with men and eating disorders and body image issues, which we've talked about before, or ADHD related stuff. There are a lot. I love doing these, and I mean, the hour goes by so fast. We'll have to do a part 2 or something, but I love doing these, guys, because it's just fun talking with you guys. But also I get emails from people all over around just these things that they hear and it just grabs them, and they think, oh my gosh, I felt heard and I felt seen. And that to me is like gold. I mean, that to me is like the best feeling, because this medium of is just wonderful that, so I do them as much as I can fit into my schedule.
I love it. Yeah, we'll definitely have you back on. Roberto, thank you again so much for this. This was excellent. Just as good as the first time.
My pleasure. Let's do it again.
Absolutely. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Okay. Have a good week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You too. All right. That was great. So everyone, if you'd like to follow us, you could follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram, on Twitter or X, we're Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe, hit the bell on YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.